Incredibly, this is the last game of classical chess that Alireza Firouzja played. So it was played last year in 2021 on the 21st of November. It was the last game of the European Team Championship. Alireza was representing France and he was playing Shakhriyar Mamedyarov in this game. And this game is very special because it helped him cross 2800, an incredible feat at just 18 years of age. But since this game, he's not played any classical chess, so we're itching to see him back in action. He will be playing in just over a week in the Grand Chess Tour, and Mamedyarov is one of the guys he'll be playing. So I'm taking a look back at some old games of the guys he'll be playing soon, reliving those incredible moments. Let's see what happened in this one. So he kicked off here with pawn to e4, e5 from Shak, and we went in for this line known as the Italian game or the Guccio piano. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Hard to say Italian words. Bishop c4, bishop c5. Shak brings his one outside the pawn chain. Castles from Alireza. Knight to f6. Pawn d3 here. And h6 from Shak. Very standard stuff. Stops any bishop g5 lines. Now we had pawn c3. Pawn d6. The rook came to e1, castles from Shak, and Alireza also goes with this h-pawn move, gives the king a bit of room, stops bishop g4, and a5 now from Shak. Queenside expansion, allowing that bishop to retreat here, and we're actually following the Alireza versus David Howell game, which he played in the FIDE Grand Swiss just a couple of weeks before this one. I also covered that recently on the channel, so I'll link it at the end. And in that one, after knight d2 from Alireza, bishop e6 challenging, there Alireza went bishop to b5, keeping pieces on the board, keeping tension. But here he goes for a different approach. He takes on e6, and it's not considered so dangerous for black. The pawn recaptures, you open the f-file, you lend support to these light squares. Black should be doing okay here, but Alireza's done some homework. So he goes knight to b3, kicks back this bishop, then bishop e3 to swap those ones off. We had the exchange here, rook recaptures. Now Shak kicks on with a4, gaining some space, kicks the knight into d2. Looks like you've lost the tempo there, which you have with this knight, but then black also lost the tempo like this before capturing on e3. So it swings and roundabouts, white still has an edge. Shak goes d5 immediately, just striking in the centre, makes some sense when you've got this supporting pawn, and Alireza doesn't capture there immediately. If he did, then he brings this knight in like this, the rook could drop back, but after knight to f4, rook e3, here the knight can actually take on d3. Now just remember this position, there's a reason I'm showing you this, because if we run this exact same position now in just a moment, we'll see a key difference between what happened in the game. So Alireza didn't capture on d5, he played rook e2, and now Shak goes pawn to b5. And this looks really logical, you're looking to go b4 soon, but now Alireza takes on d5. And after the knight recaptures, he goes pawn a3, stopping b4, and after knight to f4 hitting his rook, rook e3, now Shak doesn't take on d3 because this is subtly different. Now white has queen to e2, and this time, as well as attacking the knight, you're x-raying this undefended pawn. So if the knight drops back to f4, well this time you lose on b5, white has a good game. If you take on b2, this is even worse because after white captures here, you've got two pieces attacked, this is completely lost. So that's why Shak didn't take that pawn on d3. Instead, he played queen e8 here, a really fighting move because he could have dropped back with knight d5, looking for some kind of repetition and a draw. Now with this move, he's looking to come to g6 and start attacking. So Alireza has to respond. He goes g3, an excellent move because he gives this pawn which Shak takes. Now again, knight d5 would seem to be best, just centralizing that knight, making the rook move, game goes on. But Shak takes the plunge, he captures on h3, king g2, knight g5, but now Alireza takes. After the pawn recaptures, although black is a pawn up, queen g4 really highlights the frailties in this black pawn structure. these are doubled on G file and E file. This is better for white. So rook f5 played, great move from Shak, holds both pawns, using that pawn to support. Knight f3 from Alireza, so he targets those weakened pawns. And now queen f7 from Shak, another good move, pressuring on the f file, not only against this piece, but also the backwards f2 pawn, which would be falling with check. So he goes queen e4, in a really beautiful square for that queen. It looks at the knight, also looks at the rook behind, so you can't move this knight away, and also x-rays this h7 square. So rook f8 played now by Shak, so he leaves that whole piece on prise. But if Alireza takes immediately, then pawn g4 comes, you're winning back this knight, because if you move it, then black's crashing through on f2 with check and actually a mating attack. So Alireza doesn't take on c6 immediately. He goes rook to h1. Now if this rook were to ever move, I know you wouldn't go to f4, you'd get taken, but just to show the theme, then white simply mates on h7. That's the problem, that rook is now pinned, and so pawn g6 was played to break this attack of the queen. Now it wasn't actually the best. Queen f6 would have been better, just waiting on the position, waiting for white to take, then go g4, which we see in the game. And we'll see why g6 isn't so great in just a moment. That pawn actually becomes a bit weak. So after pawn g6, Alireza now takes on c6. He picks up that piece, a whole piece up here, but Shak's got it covered with pawn to g4. As said, if you move the knight, say taking on e5, well, not only are you checking, you're actually mating the white king here and all the variations. Feel free to work that one out, of course. So we didn't have the knight moving, king g1 was an excellent move, and now Shak picks up that piece back. We had rook captures here, and now the queen took back, very logical, keeping the file open, not taking with the pawn, but now Alireza can take on e6 with check. So the material's level now, but white's got the initiative here, as we can see, and already black has to tread carefully. If you block with the rook, for example, you're getting mated after queen to e8 check. If the rook blocks again, then we checkmate here. If the king steps to g7, then we checkmate on h8. This rook boxes in the king, a really nice checkmate. So we didn't have this rook blocking. Equally, if you jump up the board with king g7, then we take here with check. And we'd get something similar to the game where the queen blocks, but at least in this variation, when the queens come off, black hasn't actually lost the e5 pawn. So this is what actually happened. Now the rook recaptured. But here's the big problem for black. After rook h4, which Alireza played, targeting this one, he'll then be threatening this one, which is undefended. So Shak went active, rook d7, Alireza took here, and now if black tries to defend this pawn, well then white gets d4 with a good game. You save this d3 pawn. So Shak correctly saw that he should capture on d3. Then yes, Alireza takes here with check, king f7, but at least Shak can get some play going with rook d2 and that kind of thing. So rook c6 from Alireza, he targets this one. He went rook to d2 immediately. And now Alireza pushes c4 first. He breaks up those queenside pawns. Shak captured on b2. Alireza took with check, and after the king moved, he checked again and only then took on b5 after the king hit this f5 square. So Shak now goes rook to b3. He's picking up that queenside pawn. Pawn b6, takes on a3, pawn b7, but the rook covers just in time now. White also has to come and corral this one or it's going through. We have this liquidation on the queen side. Looks like it's heading towards a draw, right? But actually this is not such an easy 2-on-1 to hold. And the big problem here is that this one's actually quite weak potentially. This one's also a passer, so very tricky for black. So e4 was played by Shak to start with. We had check from Alireza on a5. And now already you have to tread carefully. If you go king to g4, for example, well then rook e5. We attack this pawn, say you defend with king to f3, rook f5 check, king e2, and now king g2 stops that king from coming back. We're threatening to go rook e5, so say black covers, well then we go g4 and this one's running. And these are the kind of themes of the position, cutting off the king, then pushing the g pawn. in combination with attacking this e-pawn. These are the big problems. So king f6 was played after the check. Now this king came to f1, the rook came to b3, stopping it from invading, winning this pawn, king e2 anyway, rook c3 holds the rank, and now rook a8 from Alireza. So he's swinging behind the black king. Rook b3 played, we had this check, and Shak once again has a decision to make. So if he comes this side, well then we go rook f4, and we're soon corralling this pawn, the 2-on-1 will be winning. So king e5 was forced, holding the pawn, but now king f1, and Alireza switches the king back round. He's cut the black king from this side, and Shak only has one move here to actually hold a draw, a really beautiful idea. And if you're enjoying this video, do let me know by hitting that like button, and consider subscribing to the channel to never miss my Alireza coverage. So here Shak had to find the brilliant move, rook to f3. Now without going through all the variations of white starting to check, if white takes this one, pawn recaptures, well although you've got this passed pawn, black can actually maintain an opposition here. So say you go king e1 for example, well we can just maintain this distant opposition like this, and if you start pushing that passed pawn, then the king runs back over. I can see my computer's running slow, that king is moving very slowly. But anyway, king d2, you could have this sort of thing marching in, and ultimately black will be able to hold this endgame, because once you pick up the f3 pawn, then you take the opposition. This is a well-known draw. So coming all the way back here to king f1, rook f3 was the move to hold the draw, but Shak couldn't find it. He went king to d4 here. Now we had king to g2, and the problem here is that the g pawn now starts running. So rook b7 from Shak, king h3, the king came back to e5, and now g4 was actually the final move of the game here. The black king is completely cut, the pawn is running. Just to show a quick sample variation, say you check from h7, king g3, rook g7 comes in front of the pawn, but then rook f5 check. And after the king gives ground, your king's invading. This is the problem. You're also attacking this weak one as well as pushing this outside passer. It's too much for black to cope with. If you enjoyed this video and want to see my Alireza versus David Howell video, click here. Thanks for watching. See you soon.